In the early 1940s, as the sun rose over the Pacific and the Empire of Japan reached its greatest territorial height, a quiet war of numbers, signals, and assumptions was already shaping the fate of nations. Before the year 1942, deep within the naval intelligence offices of Tokyo's Naval General Staff, analysts pored over reports from their observers stationed across Hawaii, Manila, and the American West Coast. The data were meticulous: counts of warships in Pearl Harbor, tallies of shipyard outputs in California, and lists of newly commissioned aircraft carriers and battleships. Yet beneath the surface of this seemingly precise intelligence lay a profound and fatal flaw. Japan's understanding of American military potential was not merely incomplete. It was filtered through the lens of its own institutional mindset. This phenomenon, known to historians as the mirror image mistake, became one of the most consequential intelligence failures of the Second World War. At the heart of this story stood Japan's Naval Intelligence Bureau, or Kaigan Gunraibu, whose officers were among the most disciplined and technically skilled in the imperial system. They gathered their information with patience and accuracy. Japanese consular officials in Honolulu, for instance, produced detailed maps of ship anchorages, sometimes updated weekly. Long before the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, they knew the tonnage of American battleships and even the displacement of each aircraft carrier. However, what they could not quantify, and what their superiors in Tokyo cannot fully grasp, was the capacity of the United States to replace those ships, rebuild those fleets, and train new men faster than Japan could imagine. Japanese naval officers believed, based on their own experience, that the process of creating a warship was inseparable from the painstaking years required to train its crew. In Japan, every sailor was a specialist molded through long apprenticeship, and the national industrial base was limited. Therefore, they assumed the same limitations existed in the United States. When American shipyards began launching Liberty ships and escort carriers at a pace measured in weeks, not years, it defied their expectations. Tokyo's intelligence officers dismissed early signs of this industrial acceleration as exaggerated propaganda. It was not a lack of information, it was a failure of imagination. The roots of this misjudgment reached back to the interwar years, during the fragile peace shaped by the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. That treaty restricted battleship tonnage among major powers, including Japan, the United States, and Britain. Japanese strategists, such as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, accepted the agreement reluctantly but used it to rationalize a doctrine of qualitative superiority, the belief that Japan's smaller but elite forces could outfight a numerically superior enemy. This belief hardened into dogma when analysts in 1940 and 1941 estimated that the United States could expand its naval air arm tenfold if war came. Tokyo dismissed the projection as unrealistic. Japan's own experience told them that industrial and human mobilization required long-term cultural preparation. The idea that an open, industrial society could retool itself overnight ran contrary to every instinct of the Japanese bureaucracy. This mindset was a classic example of mirror imaging, the assumption that an adversary thinks, plans, and behaves according to one's own norms. Japanese intelligence applied their own logic of mobilization to a society that functioned in a radically different way. Where Japan relied on centralized control, the United States drew upon decentralized industry and volunteer manpower. Where Japan trained a small professional cadre, America mobilized entire communities. The contrast was invisible to Tokyo's planners because their intelligence assessments began with an unspoken premise that modern naval warfare required elite specialization, not mass production. A few voices in Japan's analytical community sensed the danger. Commander Fukita Mitsuo, who later led the air assault on Pearl Harbor, privately noted that American naval aviation seemed to rely on broader participation than Japan's own highly selective training. Others, such as Captain Sadatoshi Tomioka, head of operations in the Naval General Staff, warned that America's industrial democracy might produce a scale of war potential Japan could not match. Yet these warnings were lost amid institutional optimism. Japanese military culture rewarded conformity and punished dissent, especially in a system already committed to a war that would test its very foundation. By the time of the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7, 1941, Japanese naval intelligence had achieved tactical brilliance but strategic blindness. They had mapped the targets perfectly but misread the consequences. The destruction of American battleships seemed to guarantee naval supremacy in the Pacific, but the attack did not touch the American shipbuilding base or the carriers that would define the next stage of the war. Tokyo interpreted the temporary setback of the U.S. Pacific Fleet as a decisive victory that would force negotiation. Instead, it galvanized the American industrial and manpower machinery into unprecedented mobilization. After Pearl Harbor, Japan's intelligence service struggled to keep pace with the rapid transformation of its opponent. Reports from the Pacific Islands noted a steady rise in the number of American ships appearing in theaters where none had been expected. The United States Navy was regenerating not on a one-for-one basis, but exponentially, producing more hulls, more pilots, and more trained crews than Japan could destroy. In response, Japanese analysts tried to adjust their estimates, but institutional inertia persisted. They continued to believe that America's expansion was unsustainable and that morale would falter under casualties. Again, the mirror image assumption prevailed. What would have exhausted Japan, they assumed, must also exhaust the United States. The intelligence shortfall also had an organizational dimension. Japan's Navy and Army maintained separate intelligence branches, often refusing to share information. The Tokumu Suishinbu, responsible for special operations, gathered significant data from Southeast Asia but rarely shared it with naval planners. Meanwhile, signals intelligence was underdeveloped compared to allied code-breaking efforts like the American Magic and British Ultra programs. Japan's focus remained on observation rather than interpretation. They knew what the enemy had but failed to understand what it meant. By early 1942, these miscalculations began to manifest in operational planning. The Japanese Combined Fleet, led by Admiral Yamamoto, sought to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle near Midway Island. Intelligence reports indicated that the U.S. Navy had only two carriers operational in the Pacific. In reality, thanks to rapid repair work and industrial output, 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, were ready for battle. The Japanese assumption, based on their pre-war intelligence framework, underestimated the American ability to recover and redeploy. This mistake set the stage for one of the most dramatic reversals in naval history. The consequences of the mirror image mistake extended far beyond tactics. It revealed a deeper pattern in Japan's wartime decision-making, the conflation of data collection with understanding. Japanese intelligence officers were not incompetent. They were trapped in a worldview that treated culture and capacity as fixed attributes. Their measurements were precise, but their model of the world was wrong. The lesson for historians and military strategists is clear. Intelligence is not only about counting ships or decoding messages. It is about interpreting the social and industrial fabric that makes those ships meaningful instruments of power. As 1942 unfolded, Japan's early victories across the Pacific, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, appeared to confirm the soundness of its strategy. Yet beneath those triumphs lay a quiet, growing imbalance. American shipyards were already launching new destroyers and carriers faster than Japan could replace losses. American pilot training programs, built around a reserve system backed by universities, were expanding beyond Japanese comprehension. Tokyo's intelligence estimates remained anchored to outdated assumptions, even as the tide of war shifted. The mirror reflected only what Japan wanted to see. The tragedy of Japanese intelligence before and during World War II was not the absence of courage or dedication, but the absence of critical self-examination. Their system prized loyalty and harmony, virtues that turned into liabilities in the analytical sphere. When data contradicted doctrine, doctrine prevailed. When reality changed, the mirror stayed fixed. In the end, this first act of the Pacific War, from the planning rooms of Tokyo to the waters around Midway, revealed how perception can shape destiny. Japan's naval intelligence had held a clear picture of the American fleet, but a distorted image of the American nation. It was a misjudgment that would haunt every subsequent campaign, from the Coral Sea to the Marianas. The numbers had been correct, but the meaning had been lost. History would show that the most dangerous enemy is not ignorance but certainty. In early 1942, as the smoke from Pearl Harbor still hung over the Pacific, the United States began an experiment in mobilization that would reshape the course of the war and redefine the meaning of industrial warfare. Before the war, few nations had ever attempted to expand their armed forces so rapidly, so completely, and so democratically. Yet within 3 years, the United States had transformed from a nation with a peacetime navy ranked third in the world into a global maritime power that outproduced, outreigned, and outmanned every adversary. Japan's intelligence estimates, drawn from its own assumptions of limited manpower and strict hierarchy, could not comprehend the scale of this mobilization. America's ability to match industrial output with trained human capital became the decisive force that doomed Japan's Pacific ambitions. The story began not in shipyards or factories, but in communities. In December 1941, just after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt called for a great arsenal of democracy. The phrase was not rhetorical. The Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, the first peacetime draft in U.S. history, had already laid the groundwork. By the end of 1942, more than 16 million Americans had registered for service. This vast reservoir of manpower, supported by an efficient administrative system and a deeply motivated public, gave the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps access to a scale of personnel that Japan could never match. American naval bases, from San Diego to Norfolk, became living laboratories of transformation. Ordinary citizens were turned into sailors, mechanics, and pilots with astonishing speed. What made this mobilization so effective was not just the quantity of recruits, but the infrastructure that supported them. The United States established specialized training schools for nearly every function of naval warfare. The Naval Air Training Command, operating out of Pensacola and Corpus Christi, trained tens of thousands of aviators annually. Boot camps in the Great Lakes region, Newport, and Bainbridge produced disciplined seamen through streamlined instruction. American universities converted engineering programs into officer training schools, while women's auxiliary programs, such as WWII's Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, filled vital logistical and communications roles. Every layer of American society was drawn into the war effort, creating a mobilization model that blended civilian industry with military precision. For Japanese intelligence officers observing from afar, this transformation was invisible. Their pre-war estimates had pegged the U.S. Navy's manpower potential at perhaps 1 million total, assuming a long training cycle similar to their own. In reality, by late 1944, American naval personnel exceeded 3 million. Shipyards in California, Washington, and the Gulf Coast employed hundreds of thousands of workers, many of them women and minorities, who learned welding and assembly line techniques that applied directly to shipbuilding. The Kaiser shipyards, under the visionary leadership of Henry J. Kaiser, pioneered modular construction, producing Liberty ships in an average of 42 days. These were not just merchant vessels, they represented a logistical revolution, supplying fleets across the Pacific at a rate no empire had ever sustained. The mobilization of American industry was a story of synchronization. The War Production Board, established in January 1942, coordinated resources between the Navy Department and private industry. Ship designs were standardized to allow multiple yards to build the same vessel simultaneously. The result was staggering. By 1943, the United States was producing a new destroyer every few days, a new escort carrier every week, and submarines in parallel across multiple coastal facilities. Japan's estimates of U.S. shipbuilding capacity derived from pre-war industrial surveys, had been off by an order of magnitude. Tokyo continued to believe that American shipbuilding was constrained by labor and materials. They never fully appreciated the power of decentralized manufacturing and the American concept of mass production. But ships alone do not win wars. They require crews, pilots, and maintenance specialists. Here again, American efficiency defied Japanese assumptions. The United States integrated its training system with its production system. Every ship launched had a trained crew waiting. Every squadron formed had replacement pilots in the pipeline. The Bureau of Naval Personnel tracked rotations and assignments with precision, maintaining a continuous flow from training to deployment. Japan's intelligence reports, focused primarily on hardware, missed this synergy. They measured hulls, not human capital. The American mobilization effort also depended on morale and motivation, factors that intelligence analysts often dismiss as intangible. The U.S. war effort was supported by a powerful sense of unity and purpose. Hollywood, radio broadcasts, and mass communication reinforced the narrative of defending freedom and democracy. Industrial workers felt connected to soldiers overseas. Their production quotas were framed as contributions to victory. In contrast, Japanese war production was constrained by resource shortages and the rigid social hierarchy that separated officers from workers. Where American factories encouraged innovation from the ground up, Japanese factories suffered from inefficiencies caused by excessive centralization. The difference in organizational culture translated directly into strategic capability. Behind this mobilization was a technological and logistical backbone that no Japanese planner had imagined possible. The American shipbuilding revolution relied on electricity, steel, and oil supplies that dwarfed Japan's. The Tennessee Valley Authority and the Hoover Dam provided abundant energy for aluminum and steel production. Rail networks delivered parts from inland factories to coastal yards with clockwork reliability. Even the automobile industry played a crucial role. Ford's Willow Run plant, originally designed for cars, became the largest aircraft production facility in the world, producing B-2 for Liberator bombers at assembly line speed. Each of these industrial miracles expanded America's capacity to sustain naval warfare across the globe. American mobilization was also distinguished by its adaptability. When battle reports from Midway and Guadalcanal highlighted vulnerabilities, training programs and production schedules were modified almost immediately. Damaged ships were returned to combat after repairs that took weeks rather than months. Japanese observers, constrained by their doctrine of perfectionism, viewed such speed as reckless. They misunderstood that America's industrial philosophy accepted imperfection in favor of momentum. It was a system designed to evolve through iteration, not rigid adherence to hierarchy. The cultural gap between Japanese meticulous craftsmanship and American mass innovation proved strategically decisive. By late 1943, this difference had become undeniable. The United States Navy had grown from a modest pre-war force to an armada spanning the Pacific, Atlantic, and Mediterranean. Carrier groups now operated in rotation, ensuring continuous pressure on Japanese positions. Replacement systems ensured that combat losses no longer crippled operations. Japan's intelligence reports, still constrained by the mirror image bias, insisted that such output could not be sustained. Yet the statistics told another story. U.S. shipyard productivity continued to rise even as the war intensified. The manpower base was expanding faster than losses could deplete it. Perhaps the most symbolic illustration of America's mobilization came during the Battle of the Atlantic, far from the Pacific theater. The successful campaign against German U-boats demonstrated the integration of industrial, scientific, and military resources. Radar, sonar, and convoy systems were developed through collaboration between the Navy and private research institutions. These innovations quickly found their way into Pacific operations, giving U.S. forces an increasing technological edge. Japan's intelligence service noted the new capabilities but underestimated their long-term implications. They interpreted each improvement as an isolated advance rather than part of a systemic evolution. By the time the United States turned its full attention to the Central Pacific in 1944, its naval and air forces had become self-sustaining engines of warfare. Every carrier that was lost could be replaced in months. Every fallen pilot could be succeeded by a trained replacement. American mobilization was not simply about scale, it was about resilience. The Japanese Empire, bound by limited resources and rigid doctrine, could not replicate this elasticity. Their intelligence assessments, anchored to outdated pre-war assumptions, had failed to anticipate the transformation of an industrial democracy into a wartime superpower. The lessons of American mobilization continued to resonate through military history. It was not the largest fleet at the start of the war that prevailed, but the one that could regenerate faster and more intelligently. Japan's misreading of this dynamic turned its early victories into illusions. The same industrial surge that rebuilt Pearl Harbor also carried the United States across the Pacific, from the Coral Sea to the Marianas. Each ship launched, each sailor trained, was a testament to a system that combined freedom, organization, and technological adaptability. In the end, it was not just machines that won the war, but a society that understood how to mobilize its entire human and industrial capacity toward a single purpose. In June 1942, when the Pacific sun glared over the small atoll of Midway, the Empire of Japan appeared at the height of its power. For Japanese carriers, bristling with aircraft and veteran crews, advanced into what they believed would be the decisive battle of the Pacific War, Tokyo's planners were confident. Intelligence reports indicated that the U.S. Navy could field, at best, 2 operational carriers. Their strategy was simple: draw out the remaining American forces, destroy them, and secure Japan's defensive perimeter from Hawaii to the Dutch East Indies. What Japan did not realize was that their confidence rested on an illusion. The mirror image mistake that had distorted their intelligence assessments now shaped their operational choices. The very errors of perception that had seemed abstract in Tokyo's intelligence offices were about to translate into catastrophic losses on the open sea. The Battle of Midway became a turning point not just because of the ships that sank, but because of what it revealed about the limits of Japan's strategy. The Japanese combined fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had achieved remarkable victories at Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and the Indian Ocean. Each triumph reinforced the belief that bold offensives could compensate for limited resources. Japan's naval doctrine emphasized decisive battle, the idea that a single, overwhelming strike could determine the outcome of a war. It was a concept rooted in the victory over Russia at Tsushima in 1905, when superior tactics and discipline had overcome numerical inferiority. Yet in 1942, the conditions were fundamentally different. The United States could replace losses, Japan could not. When the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were destroyed at Midway, Japan lost not only for ships but also more than 300 experienced aviators and deck crewmen. These were irreplaceable specialists trained over years of rigorous apprenticeship. For the United States, the loss of the carrier Yorktown and 147 aviators was tragic but recoverable. Within months, new carriers and trained pilots filled the gap. The operational balance of the Pacific shifted irreversibly. From that moment forward, every Japanese victory would come at a cost Japan could not afford to pay. The roots of Japan's strategic overreach lay in its failure to grasp the scale and adaptability of American mobilization. The Imperial Navy had planned for a short, intense conflict, not a prolonged war of attrition. Their logistical networks were stretched thin across thousands of miles, from the Aleutians to New Guinea. Each conquest added new territory to defend, but did not increase Japan's industrial base. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies, crucial to sustaining the fleet, were vulnerable to submarine attacks. Yet Tokyo continued to commit forces to expansive operations, assuming that American counteroffensives would be delayed by slow production and training cycles. This assumption proved disastrously wrong, as American shipyards launched new classes of carriers and destroyers at record speed. Japan's inability to replenish its losses became painfully clear. The Battle of the Solomon Islands in late 1942 and early 1943 exposed the imbalance. While Japan's night-fighting tactics and naval gunnery remained formidable, their logistics were collapsing. The famous Tokyo Express supply runs to Guadalcanal could deliver only a fraction of what was needed. The U.S. Navy, meanwhile, operated with increasing coordination between surface ships, submarines, and air reconnaissance, a triad of warfare supported by intelligence networks that Japan could not match. By mid-1943, Japan's operational overreach had turned its early conquests into liabilities. The empire's defensive perimeter now spanned too many islands and too much ocean. The combined fleet was forced to disperse, diluting its striking power. American submarine campaigns targeted oil tankers and transport convoys with ruthless efficiency. Each loss eroded Japan's ability to maneuver. Yet even as the logistical crisis deepened, Japanese military culture resisted adaptation. Doctrine remained anchored in the pursuit of decisive battle. Tokyo's admirals continued to seek opportunities for large-scale engagements, believing that one brilliant strike could reverse the tide. This thinking ignored the fundamental change in the nature of the conflict. Industrial capacity had become the true measure of power. Operationally, the consequences of Japan's intelligence errors were profound. Believing that American losses were greater than they truly were, Japan misjudged the timing and scale of future U.S. offensives. After Midway, Tokyo expected the United States to remain on the defensive for at least a year. Instead, American forces began their counteroffensive within 2 months. Landing on Guadalcanal in August 1942, the campaign marked the first sustained test of Japan's ability to fight a prolonged war. It revealed the limits of their manpower, training, and supply systems. While Japanese troops fought with ferocity, their inability to sustain reinforcement and resupply doomed them. The Imperial Navy's failure to protect its supply lines reflected the same analytical blindness that had underestimated American industrial potential. As the war moved into 1943, American operational strategy evolved into a methodical advance known as island hopping. Guided by superior intelligence and code-breaking, the U.S. Navy bypassed heavily fortified Japanese bases, isolating them and cutting off supplies. Japan's efforts to predict or counter these moves were hampered by their outdated intelligence methods. They still relied heavily on visual reconnaissance and sporadic radio intercepts, while the Americans employed cryptographic breakthroughs like the decryption of the Japanese naval code JN-5. Information asymmetry became a force multiplier. Every U.S. advance was supported by precise intelligence, while Japan fought increasingly in the dark. The psychological dimension of operational overreach also deserves attention. Japan's early victories had created a culture of invincibility. The destruction at Midway was initially downplayed in public communications. Tokyo's propaganda insisted that the carriers were only damaged, not sunk. Internally, the Naval General Staff feared that acknowledging the loss would demoralize both military personnel and civilians. This denial delayed necessary reforms. Training programs remained inadequate, aircraft production lagged, and inter-service rivalry between the Navy and the Army persisted. Strategic adaptation requires humility, but in wartime Japan, humility was interpreted as weakness. By contrast, the United States learned quickly from each engagement. The experiences of Midway and Guadalcanal informed new doctrines for carrier warfare, amphibious operations, and joint command. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur coordinated their respective Pacific campaigns with remarkable efficiency. Each victory brought lessons that were applied almost immediately to the next operation. This iterative process reflected a culture of problem-solving that Japan's rigid hierarchy could not replicate. The U.S. Navy's integration of logistics, intelligence, and tactical innovation turned operational lessons into strategic momentum. One of the most decisive operational developments during this period was the emergence of task force warfare, the concentration of multiple carriers operating under unified command. The fast carrier task forces, beginning with Task Force 58, represented a new model of naval power. They combined mobility, striking power, and sustainability in a way that overwhelmed Japanese defenses. Japan's attempts to replicate this structure faltered due to lack of pilots, fuel, and coordination. The American system could afford to take risks and recover quickly. Japan's could not. Each major engagement further depleted Japan's pool of veterans, replacing them with inexperienced recruits who lacked the training to handle complex operations. Operational overreach also had economic consequences. Japan's industrial base was never designed for total war. Factories operated under resource shortages and air raid threats. Shipbuilding was limited by steel and fuel constraints. While American shipyards produced hundreds of vessels simultaneously, Japanese yards struggled to complete a handful. The difference was not merely quantitative, it reflected contrasting worldviews. The American war machine was decentralized, flexible, and powered by private enterprise under government coordination. Japan's system was centralized, rigid, and burdened by bureaucratic inefficiency. Each failed operation deepened the gap. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, sometimes called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the operational consequences of Japan's miscalculations were fully exposed. American carrier pilots, trained in vast numbers and supported by radar and advanced aircraft, annihilated Japan's remaining air power. In a single day, Japan lost nearly 400 planes and most of its experienced aviators. The battle was more than a tactical defeat, it was the symbolic death of Japan's naval air arm. Tokyo's earlier confidence that America could not sustain high-tempo operations had been shattered. Yet Japan's leadership persisted in its belief that one final decisive engagement could change the outcome. This fixation set the stage for the final act of the Pacific War, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The operational arc from Midway to Leyte was defined by the widening gap between perception and reality. Each Japanese offensive was based on an outdated understanding of the enemy's capabilities. Each loss deepened Japan's dependency on hope over analysis. What began as a war of daring maneuvers had become a war of attrition, and in such a war, only one side had the resources to endure. The United States had learned to convert intelligence into action, production into presence, and losses into lessons. Japan, trapped by its own assumptions, could only react. By 1944, Japan's naval strategy had become reactive rather than proactive. Its forces were deployed not to win, but to delay defeat. Operational overreach had transformed ambition into desperation. The same intelligence errors that once promised swift victory now ensured inevitable collapse. The mirror image mistake, born in the quiet offices of pre-war Tokyo, had become the defining force of Japan's downfall. In October 1944, as the Pacific typhoon season gathered over the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Japanese Navy prepared for its final and most desperate gamble. The operation was codenamed Shogo Victory Operation. It was conceived not as a realistic plan for victory, but as a last act of defiance meant to defend the lifeline to Southeast Asia. The Philippines, especially the island of Leyte, represented the crossroads of Japan's empire. Its capture by the United States would sever Japan's access to the oil of Borneo and the Dutch East Indies. Yet the Japanese High Command, still haunted by its earlier intelligence misjudgments, failed to grasp that the U.S. Navy now possessed overwhelming superiority in ships, aircraft, and trained personnel. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would become the largest naval engagement in history and the symbolic conclusion of Japan's Pacific ambitions. By late 1944, the contrast between the two navies was staggering. The United States Navy operated more than 100 aircraft carriers of various classes, from fleet carriers to escort carriers. Japanese naval intelligence had once estimated that the United States could not maintain more than 10. The Americans had over 1,500 warships in the Pacific. Japan could field barely one-fifth of that number. Even worse, Japan's remaining ships were crippled by shortages of fuel and ammunition. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, chief of the combined fleet, understood that victory was impossible in a conventional sense. Yet he approved Operation Shogo out of duty and desperation, hoping to inflict enough damage to delay the inevitable invasion of the home islands. Japan's plan was complex and ambitious. 3 separate fleets would converge on Leyte Gulf. The northern force, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, would serve as bait, a decoy composed of nearly empty aircraft carriers meant to lure Admiral William F. Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the main battle. The center force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, consisted of battleships and cruisers, including the massive Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever built. A southern force under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would approach from the Sulu Sea. The plan depended on precise timing, flawless coordination, and the assumption that the Americans would react predictably. It was, in essence, an operational echo of Japan's earlier faith in decisive battle, and a reflection of how little the strategic mindset had evolved since Midway. On the American side, intelligence and reconnaissance had reached extraordinary sophistication. The U.S. Navy's codebreakers had deciphered much of Japan's naval communications. Submarine patrols and air reconnaissance provided real-time updates on enemy movements. When Kurita's center force was first detected near Palawan on October 23, American submarines darted and Dace ambushed the formation, sinking to heavy cruisers, including Kurita's flagship Atago. The loss was a devastating blow before the main battle had even begun. Yet Kurita pressed on, driven by orders that equated withdrawal with dishonor. This mindset of inflexible determination, so characteristic of Japan's wartime command culture, would again lead to disaster. As Kurita advanced through the Sibuyan Sea, his fleet came under relentless attack from carrier-based aircraft of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. Waves of American bombers struck with precision and coordination that reflected years of cumulative experience. The battleship Musashi, pride of the Japanese fleet, absorbed more than 20 torpedoes and numerous bombs before finally capsizing. Despite this, Kurita managed to continue toward Leyte, unaware that Halsey's carriers had been drawn north by Ozawa's decoy force. It was a fleeting moment when Japan's gamble seemed to gain a sliver of hope. On the morning of October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar, Kurita's fleet encountered a small group of American escort carriers and destroyers, Task Unit 77.4, known as Taffy 3, composed primarily of lightly armed vessels supporting ground operations. Taffy 3 was completely unprepared for a direct confrontation with battleships. Yet in one of the most astonishing displays of courage in naval history, the American sailors fought back with ferocity. Destroyers like the Johnston and Hull launched torpedo attacks against overwhelming odds. Carrier pilots, running out of ammunition, made mock strafing runs to distract Japanese gunners. The chaos and smoke confused Kurita's commanders, who believed they were facing a much larger force. After hours of brutal combat, Kurita unexpectedly ordered a retreat. The psychological toll of relentless air attacks and the fear of American reinforcements shattered his will to continue. Japan's last chance to disrupt the Leyte landings vanished. Meanwhile, to the north, Halsey's forces obliterated Ozawa's decoy carriers. Although the U.S. Admiral's decision to chase the bait left the invasion fleet temporarily exposed, the overall result was decisive. Japan's carrier aviation, already crippled after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Most of Ozawa's aircraft had no trained pilots. The few that did were destroyed. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended with the near-total destruction of Japan's remaining naval power. In 4 days of fighting, Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, along with thousands of sailors and the last remnants of its elite naval aviators. The human dimension of Leyte was tragic, Many Japanese sailors went down with their ships, victims of a command culture that equated surrender with shame. Survivors spoke later of confusion and despair. They fought bravely but without a realistic purpose. Their commanders, clinging to outdated notions of honor, had led them into a battle that could not be won. The Americans, though victorious, were deeply moved by the courage of their adversaries. Reports from the aftermath describe sailors rescuing Japanese survivors from the sea, acts of humanity amid devastation. From a strategic perspective, Leyte Gulf was the irreversible collapse of Japan's naval options. After the battle, the Imperial Navy no longer had the ships, fuel, or trained personnel to mount large-scale operations. The remnants of the fleet retreated to Japan's home waters, where they would be destroyed by air power in the months that followed. Japan's war economy, already strangled by submarine blockades and fuel shortages, could not recover. The campaign to defend the Philippines became an exercise in sacrifice rather than strategy. The desperate introduction of kamikaze tactics during the Leyte campaign, suicide pilots who crashed into American ships, reflected a grim acknowledgement that conventional warfare had failed. It was the final manifestation of Japan's strategic despair, born from years of misjudging its opponent. The Battle of Leyte Gulf also symbolized the culmination of a broader historical process, the triumph of industrial warfare over artisanal military culture. Japan's pre-war naval doctrine had prized craftsmanship, precision, and individual skill. The United States, by contrast, had mastered the integration of technology, mass production, and organization. The results were visible in every detail of Leyte, in the coordination of carrier strikes, the reliability of radar-directed gunnery, and the seamless logistics that sustained operations across thousands of miles. Japan had entered the war believing that spirit and training could offset material inferiority. Leyte proved that in modern warfare, industrial capacity and adaptability decide survival. In the years following the war, historians and military analysts studied the Leyte campaign not only for its scale, but for its lessons in decision-making. Japanese naval officers who survived admitted that by 1940 they had known the war was unwinnable, yet they lacked the political authority to alter course. The system that had once rewarded obedience now punished realism. Intelligence remained subordinate to ideology. The same mirror image assumption that had distorted Japan's view of American mobilization before the war persisted until the end, the belief that Americans, like Japanese, would lose the will to fight after suffering heavy losses. Instead, American determination only intensified. The collapse of Japan's naval power after Leyte Gulf marked the beginning of the end. Within 9 months, the U.S. Navy had advanced to Okinawa. The Imperial Japanese Navy, reduced to coastal defense and kamikaze missions, ceased to function as a coherent force. The battleships Yamato and Nagato, once symbols of national pride, were destroyed before they could make any meaningful contribution. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, its navy was a shadow of its former self. The defeat was not sudden but cumulative, the inevitable outcome of years of miscalculation, rigid thinking, and underestimated opponents. The Battle of Leyte Gulf stands today as both a monument and a warning. It demonstrates how intelligence failures, institutional rigidity, and cultural assumptions can destroy even the most formidable military machine. Japan's early victories in the Pacific had been spectacular, but they were built on illusions that crumbled under the weight of American mobilization and technological innovation. By the end, Japan's admirals were commanding ghosts, ships without fuel, squadrons without pilots, strategies without hope. In the final analysis, the story from Midway to Leyte is not merely about battles, but about perception. It is the chronicle of how a nation blinded by its own assumptions misread the nature of modern war. The same nation that struck with surgical precision at Pearl Harbor failed to see that war in the industrial age is not won by the first blow, but by the ability to endure and adapt. From Midway to Leyte, the tide turned not through chance, but through the cumulative power of learning, production, and relentless will. The Pacific War ended as it had begun, on the sea, but this time the wines favored a different kind of strength, one born not of empire, but of innovation and collective resolve.